Could the long-awaited Mueller report actually mark the best day of Donald Trump's presidency? US Attorney General William Barr has released a 4-page summary of the investigation into whether any of President Trump's people colluded with Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election, and also whether President Trump attempted to obstruct justice. 19 lawyers and 40 FBI agents, intelligence officers and forensic accountants worked on the 2-year investigation. Its findings, according to the summary, there's no evidence anyone from the Trump campaign colluded, but as for obstruction, the report couldn't decide either way. I asked the BBC's Jon Sopel if these 4 pages exonerate President Trump.
He thinks they do. He thinks that this is as clean a bill of health as you can get. And you know what? He's not far wrong. The Mueller inquiry broke down into 2 pieces, if you like. The first was there collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians in the lead up to the 2016 presidential election? On that, there is no ambiguity as far as I can see. In the summary that's been provided by the Attorney General, based on what the Mueller report says, it says an absolute clean bill of health. There was no conspiracy, there was no collusion, there was no kind of systematic cooperation between the Russians and the Trump campaign. So, tick. That bit, there was no collusion. Donald Trump always insisted there was no collusion. He's got a clean bill of health there. Let's go on to the second bit.
Yeah, obstruction. Obstruction of justice.
Yeah, exactly. The conclusion of the Attorney General is that there is not sufficient evidence to establish that the President committed an obstruction of justice offence. However, in this 4-page summary prepared by the Attorney General, there is an important line which is taken from the Mueller report, and the special counsel states that, and I quote, "While this report does not conclude that the President committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him." Now, if you're a Democrat in Washington, D.C., you're going to want to pick at that. You're going to say, well, what does that actually mean? What is the evidence that Mueller bases that judgment on? Why wasn't there a crime? Why doesn't he exonerate him? And so you're going to see repeated demands now for papers and people to come before the Judiciary Committee of the House, to come before the Intelligence Committee and explain all of that. And I think that's what you're going to see where the focus of that is. I think there is a risk that the Democrats can overplay their hand here. The headlines tonight are, Donald Trump gets clean bill of health. The White House is saying he's got a clean bill of health. Donald Trump is saying, I've been totally exonerated. I think an awful lot of people will move on. I think the risk for the Democrats is that they look like they are trying to mount a coup against the president and not focusing on the issues that ordinary American people think about: health, education, and all the rest of it.
But as you point out, the door is still slightly ajar, and people will also be asking the question, won't they, about the Attorney General, because the Attorney General's making the final call on this. The Mueller report doesn't say either way. He leaves the legal fact to the Attorney General over the obstruction of justice issue. What is the relationship between President Trump and William Barr?
William Barr is a relatively new appointee as Attorney General. He is someone who expressed some reservations about the Mueller investigation. He was also a close friend of Robert Mueller, and the two have worked closely together. He served in the George H.W. Bush's administration as Attorney General. He is not seen as a kind of a Trump pushover, and William Barr has got nothing to prove. I mean, he's long in the tooth. This is going to be his last job. He was brought back from, being in the private sector to come and do this job. He doesn't have to be a cheerleader for Donald Trump. And so I think that establishment Republicans found him a slightly reassuring figure. You also asked about, aren't people going to demand X, Y, and Z? I think my experience of politics over covering it for 30 plus years is that people have very limited attention spans. People kind of, look, if they published the full Mueller report with all the appendices, I'm sure there are a few people who would read every single word and say, look, there is this question here on page 74, paragraph 3, that I need answers to, that the American people need answers to. But I think that, broadly speaking, the Mueller investigation has been going on for 22 months. People have, Democrats particularly, have put a lot of faith in Robert Mueller. If the conclusion is as William Barr states it to be, then Donald Trump is in a pretty strong position, and Democrats are going to have to reconcile themselves. But if they want to turf Donald Trump out of the White House, they're going to have to do it via the ballot box in November 2020. Nothing much else is going to happen before that, on the basis of what we've seen tonight from the Mueller summary that has been given out by the Attorney General.
Jon, what do you think the chances are of a full document dump here?
I think slim. Two aspects to this. If someone isn't going to be charged, but the report contains criticism of their behaviour, is it fair to that person that they are subject to criticism if there has been no legal wrongdoing? And that is something that the Justice Department is wrestling with, because they think, broadly speaking, if someone is indicted, then of course they face the full force of the law. But if they could have been more candid or whatever, but no action is being taken against that individual, is it fair that their name should be put into the public sector? Look, there'll be people who will be surprised, astonished. People see this through the prism of their own politics. And if you love Donald Trump, you're going to say it was always a hoax, it was always a witch hunt, how disgraceful that this ever took place, and how disgraceful of people like me in the media to report what was going on. And if you hate Donald Trump, you're going to say, this is ridiculous, how can this possibly be? He's guilty as charged, I don't believe it. That is where we are in politics, not just in the US, but in a lot of places around the world. But you know what? Everyone put faith in the Mueller investigation. It has carried on its work for nearly 2 years now. And I think at the end of it, Donald Trump has got pretty much a clean bill of health. And, it's interesting. He arrived back at the White House a very short time ago. He stood before the cameras. He waited until there was silence and no one was shouting questions. And he said, America is the greatest place on earth. He walked into the White House without taking a single question. And I thought, you know what? That is what relief sounds like. It's the old saying that goes back hundreds of years that, if you're going to take a shot at the king, you better not miss. And what's happened in Washington is that a lot of people who opposed Donald Trump had hoped, invested huge hope, that this might be the end of the Trump presidency. It's nothing like that.
Jon, it's a pleasure to talk to you as always. Thank you.
And Lisa, I'm sorry, I just wanted to say and express kind of my complete and total condolences for what has happened in New Zealand, but also watching from 10,000 miles away, total respect to the New Zealand people and the way they've conducted themselves over this hideous episode in Christchurch. I mean, you've shown the world how to behave.
And that was the BBC's Jon Sopel.